This is Dr. Don Eddy with Terrible Schools. There are plenty of reasons that public schools are just terrible. Some reasons that people cite are reasons that are not actually productive in lieu of the real problems that I perceive in public education. In particular, I'm referring to a video that I looked at called "The Problem with American Education" by Second Thought. I'm definitely not one to promote cancel culture and want it to be clearly understood that I'm not making this video to tell people to not support Second Thought or to disparage him as a person. In fact, I suggest you go ahead and check him out on your own. I actually have more disagreements with his video about education rather than agreements, and that's why I'm making this video. I want it to be fair from the perspective that if I do agree with somebody, I think that it's just right for me to admit that I agree instead of glossing over the points where I might agree just to talk about the things I don't agree with. I think that it's important for people of varying ideas to find common ground and just find a way to work from there. To be completely transparent, I left a thumb down on his video after I saw it, and I told him I'd be making this video to explain why I gave him that rating. I don't expect everybody to make a video explaining their negative feedback on YouTube, but as a content creator, it would at least seem fair if people would give honest criticism as to why they leave these negative remarks. At least give the person an opportunity to improve. In general, just calling people names and leaving thumb down interactions alone, they don't help people to change their perspective at all. I do agree with Second Thought where he says the U.S. spends more on education than anywhere else on the planet, and that one just can't throw money at the problem and claim to be the best. However, he soon seems to contradict himself right after this by saying that one of the main problems with public schools is underfunding. Second Thought gave what I would paraphrase as an anecdotal description of school being unpleasant because they require discipline. He described a strictly regimented schedule with a teacher giving orders and punishing kids who don't comply with the structure. The thing I find to be most interesting about this is the overwhelming majority of workplace employment require employees to follow structure. There is a variety of decorum expected in different facets of society. In court, it's expected to call the judge your honor and say yes sir and no ma'am, despite if these are the rules established in school or in the home. Kids have to understand this when they become adults, so they have to understand as teenagers that it's important to be able to put on different faces and wear different hats depending on the situation. In school, there is a time to talk and socialize, but the main purpose of being there is to learn, just like the main purpose of work is to earn. Second Thought says that most socialization came outside of school hours. Is that not where most socialization outside of regular employment happened? He then compares the school setting to that of prisons because of similar architectural design. Again, I can concede to a point, but what he doesn't state is how the same people who design prisons and schools also design hospitals, libraries, and other government buildings. It's almost as if he's trying to tie a false narrative to suggest that schools are run like prisons. I will agree with him also that public schools spend way too much time with standardized testing. By virtue of the U.S. being in the middle of the pack globally in regard to education, one would think that a public outcry for change would be imminent. I do disagree that low pay drives teachers away from the field. Low pay is expected from the gate. I've never heard of any teacher who thought that through teaching they would be able to gain untold financial riches. I also believe that some more nuance needs to be added to the basic idea that people might say teachers should, let's say, make $100,000 a year, but what they don't understand is you're going to have to increase tax revenue to make something like that possible. There's also other nuance to be added when he said teachers suffer from long work hours. I believe that long work hours wouldn't be so bad if they were actually productive hours leading to positive student outcomes. Instead, what happens in reality is that long hours end up being from mindless, redundant tasks that result in documents meant for other adults that don't positively affect student outcomes. Second thought, he also says that there are three main issues which plague the education system: schools being outdated, underfunded, and the rapid privatizations of schools. I will concede, schools are outdated for a lot of students. One idea that wasn't mentioned in the video is to teach students to get in touch with nature before they enter the virtual world. Technology has evolved faster than human morality, and students would benefit from understanding how to navigate the world if current technology wasn't a thing. For example, teaching kids how to grow their own food, how to fish, how to hunt, how to recognize wild edibles, how to make their own clothes. Those types of skills would benefit them in a way that could fundamentally change society. Imagine that if kids were doing this, they would have to be outside by default. I believe that since people are natural creatures, it's in our benefit to be in touch with nature. Second thought said that schools being outdated was a primary issue, but he didn't really address this issue at all until later in his video. But he did give a history lesson of public and private schools before going on a tirade about the rapid privatization of schools. During this history lesson, Second Thought states that private schools in the U.S. predate public schools. He turned right around and then said privatization is turning over once public responsibilities to privately owned companies. He then interjects his bias against capitalism in general, which is a different argument from privatization in education on its own.
Since the 80s, there's been a consensus, a deeply flawed one, but a consensus nonetheless, that there's nothing the government can do that the private sector can't do better.
Just to say that he's against a consensus and there's nothing the government can do that the private sector can't do better is just hubris. What he did do is use the Texas blackouts as an example of private companies failing, but there's a few things that he didn't end up providing. For example, he didn't mention how all over the country you have government-run utilities where people still suffer through blackouts from storms and other natural phenomena. He also didn't give an alternative example of governments doing a better job in similar circumstances. Another thing that was not mentioned is how Texas energy companies have been heavily subsidized by the government to use wind and solar power. He didn't even mention the natural gas pipelines which froze as well. He concedes private companies get things done more quickly, but then he wanted to add they do this with a greater profit.
I'm sorry, man. I kind of lost you there. You started somewhere, you ended up somewhere else, and I'm not gonna lie.
I believe that a progressive.
I have no idea what the you're talking about.
The government shouldn't be in the business of profit. That's not the goal of the government. He then went back to the well of the Texas blackouts to illustrate this point further, but I don't think he's aware of the plethora of examples where government intervention has had disastrous and expensive unintended consequences. The Eastland disaster, for example, where the government forced private companies to take extra light boats in light of the Titanic disaster. As a result, the Eastland capsized because of the extra weight mandated by a faraway government who thought they knew more than those in the industry. TSA is another example of an expensive disaster that has not caught one terrorist since its inception. But they have been successful at negative customer service and slow checkout times. Even the FAA has outdated air traffic control technology and practices that made 1 out of 5 flight delays last year possible. Second Thought claims that private infrastructure is fragile, but there are countless government infrastructure projects that consistently go over their initial budgets and don't get finished on time. This is the normal pace of government. There's no incentive for them to finish on time or budget. In the free market, people lose jobs and companies fold when projects are late and over budget. And yes, profit is a motivator, and anyone who says otherwise is lying to themselves. His basic argument is that when public funds go toward private schools, there's less money for public schools. He then created a general statement to reflect all reality when it's hardly the case. It takes a lot of mental gymnastics to blame public money going to private schools as a reason for the failure of public schools. That's an argument for the establishment if I've ever heard one. Public schools have higher per pupil expenditure than a country like Costa Rica, whose students are performing at a similar rate. If public schools were doing such a fantastic job as some would suggest, people wouldn't need other options. There is plenty of money in public education, but it isn't going towards student academic outcomes. Instead, you have bloated administrator pay, you have redundant administrators, you have cultural and social objectives instilled in the curricula, and then students fail to compete globally. Second Thought never mentioned any of this. He then says that if public schools didn't exist, there would be students who couldn't afford to go to private schools. For one, there were plenty of slaves in the United States who learned to read and write independent of public schools, which destroys his premise on the face of that. Secondly, who has made the argument to abolish public schools? Why does he come up with this premise if it isn't based in reality? I have no proof, but maybe it's because he doesn't operate from reality by saying that education is a right. It definitely isn't a federal right found in the Constitution. He says that private schools aren't held accountable for what they teach.
The other issues stem from the private schools themselves. By their very nature, private schools are not beholden to any kind of governance when it comes to what is taught within their walls.
What he fails to understand, or at least admit that he understands, is that parents are the ones who hold private schools accountable for their dollars. If their kids aren't meeting basic skills or other requirements that parents value, they pull them out. In the current public school model, a failing kid in a failing school is doomed to stay there without an affordable alternative. It's barbaric to board up a building full of children on fire and then tell them they can't leave until the government has a better option. Second Thought then goes into what I would call a classist and racist tirade against wealthy, religious, conservative white people and their education options.
What this means in essence is that most private schools skew intensely religious, conservative, and insular. Their student body is overwhelmingly white, Christian, and wealthy. Now, there's nothing inherently wrong with a parent wanting their child to get a religious education. But the problem is, in the US, Christianity has been co-opted by conservatism.
All pretenses of this video talking about actual problems in education with real solution at this point have been all but abandoned. It sounds like he's complaining that his worldview is under attack and he wishes kids could be indoctrinated in schools with his brand of dogma. He obviously doesn't understand that religious and patriotic language can help to bring people together as Americans instead of separation by groups, which is a hallmark of Marxist ideology. Marxism hates religion and capitalism. Second Thought sure sounds like a Marxist to me. I have no proof that he is, but He sounds like it.
Gone are the days when people understood Jesus to be a brown communist from the Middle East, who railed against the rich and preached inclusion, decency, and the value of living humbly. Most American Christians have grafted the language of conservatism onto their faith. Homophobia, racism, unfettered free market economics, and a rabid hatred for anything that could be considered even remotely socialist.
From my experience, when people argue this idea, they usually hate the U.S. along with traditional family values. He says it's not uncommon to see PragerU videos in class in private schools. He complains about Ayn Rand and Milton Friedman being taught. What he doesn't do is speak about it in objective terms. He gives his negative views and then expects the audience to just accept what he says at face value with his slant as if it's gospel.
In modern private schools, and I should know, I attended one, it's not uncommon to see PragerU videos shown in class. It's not uncommon to see economics classes that espouse the suicidal free market ideology of Friedman and Rand. History classes portray the U.S. as the good guy in every conflict, including those where we were clearly in the wrong.
For someone passionately against religion, he sure sounds like he got a religion. He then uses a hypothetical situation and states it as plain fact.
Today's supposedly Christian education would not be recognized as such by the Jesus of the Bible.
He doesn't lay out any specific facts to support this claim.
Instead, it's a new religion, the religion of free market conservatism. It shouldn't come as a surprise that those in power are doing their best to get more students enrolled in private school. Indoctrinating them into the cult of capitalism while they're young is the only way they can produce more pro-corporate voters.
This is pure bias on his behalf and quite disingenuous. He's not describing how privatization in general is bad. He's using fear tactics to basically say, government want to turn your kids into transphobic, homophobic, racist, religious zealots. Although he stated schools being outdated as a primary problem, it isn't until this point in the video where he starts talking about it. What he does is compare school children as cogs in a machine.
School was then and remains today an instrument to instill discipline, to mass produce agreeable little cogs for the industrial machine.
The truth is, we are all cogs in a machine for this republic of ours to function properly. And we need to find out as individuals just how we fit into this machine. What are schools supposed to be teaching kids if not how to earn an honest living for themselves? I personally give credit where credit is due, and Second Thought says that modern day schooling doesn't properly train kids for the real world.
Modern day schooling does not adequately prepare our students for the real world. Let's examine the main issues in regards to outdatedness. Which of these two hypothetical classes sounds more applicable to real life? Latin or home economics? Guess which one is more commonly taught.
His comparison between home economics and Latin isn't comparable in my view. Students who take Latin are normally on a higher education track where a class like home economics wouldn't be beneficial for that track to get accepted into a prestigious school.
If the goal of school is to prepare kids for the real world as we're meant to believe, we are doing our students a great disservice. Why don't we teach home economics classes? Why don't we teach high schoolers how to file taxes? What about useful things like basic first aid?
Home economics should be taught along with filing taxes and basic first aid. Again, I can concede to this. Second Thought didn't put too much thought into a very legitimate concern about students not having more advanced computer classes offered to them.
Then there's the fact that school curriculum just hasn't kept pace with advancements in modern technology. Basic computer classes are offered as electives, if at all. Even less common are video production, digital art, coding, web design, 3D modeling, and countless other modern skills. We're letting students down when we don't acquaint them with modern tools.
What he never talked about is the dismal basic literacy and math acquisition skills that are prerequisite to these higher order skills. He posed the question,
imagine if public schools had the funding for even a handful of art tablets or iPads. Kids could come out of middle school with skills they could translate into a rewarding career or hobby by the time they graduated from high school or college.
Kids already have plenty of access to Chromebooks, and instead of them trying to improve their skills, they are more likely to play games or watch random Instagram or YouTube videos. He does concede that Private schools have a financial incentive to succeed, so they do, but at the risk of what he calls damaging ideology.
The root cause of many of the issues our education system faces is that we simply don't have an incentive to teach our students. As with anything in America, if there's no financial incentive, nothing will change. The profit motive is the bottom line. Private schools have an incentive to at least prepare students for standardized testing, but that education comes packaged with truly damaging ideology, so making private schools more accessible would not be a long-term solution.
Which, by the way, he never objectively quantified what exactly is damaging ideology, nor where this is taking place. He then projects his fears by saying,
as those students would go on to pass even more ludicrous free market education reforms.
Second Thought offers what he calls solutions, but he hasn't thought some of these out all the way. He says that vocational schools are a financial burden on students.
One problem with vocational schools is that they typically come with a tuition, which can be a difficult burden for many families.
I'm not sure where he gets this idea, because at least in Kentucky, there are plenty of vocational schools in the public system. And I will admit there aren't hardly enough of them, but the problem isn't that parents can't afford it. There has to be some type of prerequisite skills that kids need before they can attend a vocational school, and many of them just aren't hitting these basic notes. He cites homeschooling as a solution, but then criticizes religion and says kids are maladjusted socially. Again, I give him credit for admitting that homeschools have options where school isn't hardly confined within the home itself. Schools have to have some type of level of standardization because professional decorum is expected in the real world. I will concede that there are students who don't fit the regular mode of education, but there are plenty of alternatives offered in public school settings for them. Sure, Montessori schools are an option in some cases, but he doesn't admit that there isn't enough evidence to support the idea that overall they're better than other methods. He says privatization is harming the majority, despite the majority of students coming from public schools. He never gave any empirical evidence that privatization harms the majority other than ideological grounds. Second Thought says that defunding schools have put us behind other countries. I will argue that there is plenty of funding in public schools, but public schools simply waste billions of dollars on non-educational programs and outcomes. Think about the pep rallies, field trips to see Marvel movies, and even the plethora of redundant administrators who don't positively affect student learning outcomes.
I think it's safe to say that we cannot expect the federal government to solve the problem. For at least the past 40 years, they've been completely controlled by massive corporations.
I would argue that the federal government can't help because education is local. Strangers in DC care about their agendas and getting elected. They care about numbers, where more locally they care about the faces attached to those numbers. I will concede that having smaller community schools would go a long way, but Second Thought again never addresses how these programs will be funded. Without asking him, I assumed this would be done through tax dollars, and if this was the case, what's the difference between this model and a charter school? Second Thought never mentions those words in this entire video, but in my opinion, it's an elephant in any room when talking about school choice. This is Dr. Don Eddy, and I'm going to leave you with this. Why is one child's right to an education more important than another child's right to safety?